May 27th, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk are burning. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers are trapped, their backs to the sea, waiting for death or deliverance. German artillery pounds the sand, Luftwaffe bombers scream overhead. The air smells of cordite, salt, and fear. On a commandeered fishing boat cutting through the channel, a British officer stands at the bow. He's not checking his rifle. He's not reviewing tactical maps. He's tuning a set of bagpipes. His name is Lieutenant John Malcolm Thorpe, Fleming Churchill, and in 72 hours, he will charge into Nazi-occupied France carrying a sword, a longbow, and a complete disregard for the 20th century. The German soldiers who survive the encounter will file reports that their superiors will dismiss as shell shock or battlefield hysteria. A British officer, they will claim, attacked their position with medieval weapons. He killed men with arrows. He captured prisoners at sword point, and he played music while doing it. The reports will be stamped psychologically unreliable and buried in archives. But the reports were true. Every word. This is not a story about a man who went to war. This is a story about a man who went to war in the wrong century. A man who believed that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. A man who would become the only soldier in World War II to kill an enemy combatant with a longbow, and the only Allied officer to lead a charge with bagpipes echoing across a battlefield where machine guns and mortars ruled. By the time the war ended, Mad Jack Churchill would have captured 42 German soldiers with nothing but his sword and his voice. He would survive being knocked unconscious by grenades, escape from prisoner of war camps twice, and surf in the rivers of India while bullets zipped overhead. He would be the subject of Nazi intelligence briefs trying to determine if he was real or Allied propaganda. And he would express genuine disappointment when Germany surrendered, remarking that if it wasn't for those damn Yanks, they could have kept the war going another 10 years. The experts said his methods were suicidal. The manual said his weapons were obsolete. His own commanders thought he was insane. But Mad Jack Churchill proved something the modern military had forgotten: that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield isn't the one with the most firepower. It's the one the enemy never expects. And absolutely no one expected a sword. To understand the man who would terrify the Wehrmacht with medieval weapons, you have to understand where he came from. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born September 16, 1906, in what is now Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, to a family of British colonial administrators. His childhood was privilege and adventure. Tropical jungles, mountain expeditions, a world where the British Empire still ruled a quarter of the globe, and a young man could dream of heroic deeds. But Jack Churchill wasn't interested in administrative work. He wasn't interested in business or politics or any of the respectable careers his family envisioned. He was interested in two things: adventure and style. By the time he was a teenager, he had already developed the personality that would define his entire life. He was utterly fearless, completely unconventional, and convinced that life should be lived like an epic tale from a storybook. In 1926, at age 20, he graduated from the Royal Military College Sandhurst. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. But peacetime military service bored him. There were no dragons to slay, no enemies to face, just endless drills and paperwork. So in 1936, after a decade of garrison duty, he did something almost unheard of for a professional officer. He resigned his commission. Jack Churchill walked away from a secure military career to pursue a life of adventure. He learned to play the bagpipes, mastering the instrument with the same intensity he brought to everything. He became an expert archer, practicing with a longbow until he could split arrows at 50 yards. He took up sword fighting, studying medieval combat techniques. He worked as a newspaper editor in Kenya, covering safaris and colonial politics. He even pursued a brief career as a male model and appeared as an extra in several films, including the 1924 silent classic The Thief of Baghdad. To his family and former colleagues, Jack Churchill seemed to be wasting his potential on eccentricities. But Jack was doing something far more important. He was becoming the most dangerous kind of warrior. One who had mastered the arts of combat not out of duty, but out of love. When war came again, he would be ready, not because he had followed the manual, but because he had written his own. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the world descended into war again, Jack Churchill didn't hesitate. He immediately rejoined the British Army, receiving a commission as a lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment once again. His superiors looked at his file. A decade out of active service, spent his time playing bagpipes and shooting arrows. They had doubts. Those doubts would not last long. May 1940. The Battle of France. The German blitzkrieg had torn through the Allied defenses. The British Expeditionary Force was in full retreat toward Dunkirk. It was chaos. Units were scattered. Command structure had collapsed. In this confusion, Lieutenant Jack Churchill found exactly what he had been looking for his entire life: a proper fight. His unit was assigned to cover the retreat of other Allied forces near the town of Lepinette. They were outnumbered, outgunned. The Germans were advancing overwhelming force. Standard military doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal: slow the enemy, fall back, preserve your force. Jack Churchill had a different idea. He was going to attack. On the morning of May 27th, as German infantry advanced through the French countryside, Jack positioned himself with his bow. Not a modern recurve, a longbow, the weapon of Agincourt. His men thought he had lost his mind. One soldier later recalled asking, "Sir, what are you doing with that?" Jack's reply was simple: "I'm going to shoot a German." The German patrol moved through the morning fog. 12 men. Experienced infantry. They were confident. Then they heard a sound no German soldier in 1940 expected to hear: the whistle of an arrow in flight. The lead German soldier dropped. A barbed arrow through his chest. The others froze in confusion and shock. Before they could react, Jack Churchill was already moving. He charged forward with his Scottish broadsword drawn, screaming a Highland war cry that hadn't been heard in combat in over 2 centuries. The German patrol panicked. This wasn't war. This was something from a nightmare. A British officer with a sword was running at them while his soldiers provided covering fire. 2 Germans raised their rifles. Jack cut them down with his blade. Another turned to run. Jack's men shot him. Within minutes, the entire patrol was dead or captured, and Jack Churchill was wiping German blood off his sword. The after-action report filed by his commanding officer was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. Lieutenant Churchill engaged the enemy with unorthodox weapons. Highly effective. Morale impact on enemy forces significant. Recommend commendation. What the report didn't say was that every officer who read it thought it was a joke, till they interviewed the survivors and the witnesses, till they saw the German soldier with the arrow wound, until they realized that Mad Jack Churchill was absolutely serious. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, as the Dunkirk evacuation unfolded, Jack Churchill made himself a legend. He led patrols behind enemy lines, he rescued wounded soldiers under fire, and every single time he went into combat, he carried his sword, his longbow, and his bagpipes. His men initially thought he was insane. Then they realized something. The enemy thought so too, and that fear was a weapon. German intelligence reports from this period show a fascinating pattern. Multiple units reported encounters with a British officer using primitive weapons and playing music. The reports were inconsistent. Some said he was leading commando raids. Others said he was a psychological warfare specialist. One report theorized he was an Allied propaganda stunt designed to make the Germans think the British had gone mad with desperation. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Jack Churchill was real, and he was just getting started. After Dunkirk, Churchill was promoted and assigned to the newly formed Commandos, Britain's elite special forces units created specifically for daring raids behind enemy lines. If regular infantry thought Jack was eccentric, the Commandos loved him. These were men selected for aggression, creativity, and the willingness to take insane risks. Jack Churchill fit right in. In fact, he thrived. The Commandos were Britain's answer to Germany's unstoppable momentum. Small units of highly trained soldiers conducting lightning raids on occupied Europe. Sabotage. Assassination. Reconnaissance. The Commandos were ghosts, and Jack Churchill was their most terrifying ghost. December 1941. Operation Archery. A commando raid on the Norwegian island of Vixie. The objective was to destroy German fish oil factories and bring back Norwegian volunteers for the resistance. Jack Churchill was second in command of the lead assault force. As the landing craft approached the beach under heavy German fire, Jack stood at the front. In one hand, his sword. In the other, his bagpipes. And he was playing. The commandos hit the beach at a dead run. Jack was first off the boat, still playing. German machine guns opened up. Bullets kicked up snow and ice around him. He didn't stop playing. He didn't stop moving. He led his men straight into the German positions, and when he finally put down the bagpipes, he drew his sword and went to work. The fighting in Vigsy was brutal, house to house, room to room. The Germans fought hard, but they had never faced anything like this. A British officer was running through the streets with a sword, killing with medieval efficiency, and every time there was a lull in the fighting, the sound of bagpipes would echo through the town. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The Germans didn't just fear the commandos. They feared the lunatic with the sword. By the end of the operation, Jack Churchill had personally led the assault that captured the German headquarters. He had killed multiple enemy soldiers with his sword. He had coordinated artillery fire while playing his bagpipes to signal troop movements. And he had captured a German commanding officer by putting a sword to his throat and politely asking him to surrender. The German officer, terrified and bewildered, complied. Years later in an interview, that officer would say, "I thought I was being captured by a ghost from the Middle Ages." It was a complete success. The factories were destroyed. Norwegian volunteers were evacuated. British casualties were remarkably light. And Jack Churchill's reputation was now legend. When he returned to Britain, his commanding officers didn't know whether to court-martial him or promote him. They chose promotion. He was made a lieutenant colonel and given command of his own commando unit. But the most famous incident of Jack Churchill's war was still to come. July 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky, the beginning of the campaign to liberate Italy from fascist control. Jack Churchill and his commandos were assigned to capture a German observation post on a coastal cliff. It was a heavily fortified position. Machine gun nests, mortars, at least 50 German defenders. The plan called for a night assault supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes. Jack Churchill looked at the plan and decided it was too complicated. He had a better idea. He would walk up to the front gate and knock. His second-in-command tried to stop him. "Sir, that's suicide." Jack's response was classic. Suicide is walking in without proper equipment. He pointed at his sword. "I have my equipment." In the early morning darkness of July 10th, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, carrying only his sword and escorted by a single corporal carrying a radio, walked up the road to the German fortification. When they were 50 yards from the gate, Jack stopped. He drew his sword. He raised it high above his head. And then he did something no one, not his own men, not the Germans, expected. He charged. The German sentries watched in frozen disbelief as a British officer ran at them screaming and waving a sword. They didn't fire. They didn't sound the alarm. They just stared. Jack hit the gate at full speed, kicked it open, and was inside the compound before anyone reacted. What happened next was chaos. Jack Churchill moved through the German position like a whirlwind. He killed the first sentry with his sword before the man could raise his rifle. He grabbed a German officer by the collar and put a blade to his throat. "Order your men to surrender," Jack said in perfect German. The officer, convinced he was facing a madman, complied. Within minutes, the entire garrison had surrendered. 42 German soldiers, captured by one British officer with a sword and one very confused corporal with a radio. When Jack's commando unit arrived minutes later expecting a firefight, they found Jack sitting on a wall playing his bagpipes, while 42 German prisoners sat in neat rows with their hands on their heads. The after-action report was 4 pages long and included the phrase "unorthodox but effective" 7 times. The commanding general personally interviewed Jack to verify the story. When he confirmed every detail, the general just shook his head and walked away muttering, "We're winning the war with a medieval knight." But Jack Churchill's war was far from over. If anything, he was just warming up. September 1943, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. Jack Churchill and his commandos were now spearheading assaults up the Italian peninsula. The fighting was brutal. The Germans had turned every hill, every town, every river into a fortress. This wasn't the quick liberation everyone had hoped for. This was a grinding war of attrition. Jack Churchill was in his element. He led raid after raid, always at the front, always with his sword. His men followed him not because they had to, but because they believed that as long as Mad Jack was leading them, they were invincible. There's a psychological phenomenon in combat. When men believe their leader cannot be killed, they fight harder. They take risks they wouldn't normally take. Jack Churchill created that belief not through speeches, but through action. He walked through machine gun fire and emerged unscathed. He charged enemy positions that should have killed him, and he kept playing those damn bagpipes. By late 1943, German intelligence had a file on him. A thick file. They knew his name. They knew his methods. They had photographs recovered from captured British positions showing him with his sword and bagpipes. Nazi propaganda tried to use him as evidence of British desperation. The English are so weak. One broadcast claimed, "They send medieval warriors to fight our modern army." But privately, German officers had issued orders. If Jack Churchill is captured, he is to be brought to high command immediately. They wanted to interrogate him. They wanted to understand if he was part of a larger psychological warfare program or just one insane individual. They would get their chance. May 1944. Yugoslavia. The war had spread to the Balkans. Jack Churchill and his commandos were fighting alongside Yugoslav partisans against German occupation forces. It was brutal guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain. No front lines. No safe zones. Just ambush and counter-ambush. On the island of Bra, in the Adriatic, Jack's force of 43 commandos and 1,500 partisans launched an attack on a German garrison. The initial assault went well. They pushed the Germans back. But then reinforcements arrived. German mountain troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, ruthless and experienced. They counterattacked with overwhelming force. Jack Churchill found himself and a small group of his commandos cut off, surrounded. They took cover in a stone building and prepared for the last stand. Jack's radio operator was killed by a mortar round. The building was falling apart around them. German soldiers were closing in from all sides. This is where most soldiers would surrender. Preserve life, become a prisoner of war. Wait for liberation. Jack Churchill had a different idea. He decided to fight until the last bullet and then keep fighting with his sword. For the next 2 hours, Jack and his men held that building. Every window was a firing position, every doorway a kill zone. The Germans threw grenades. Jack threw them back. They rushed the door. Jack met them with his sword. His men later said he killed at least 6 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat with that blade. But numbers and firepower eventually win. A mortar round hit the building. The explosion knocked Jack unconscious and buried him in rubble. When he woke up, German soldiers were pulling him out of the debris. He was wounded, bleeding. His sword was gone. His bagpipes were shattered, and he was furious. The Germans who captured him didn't realize who they had. They processed him as a regular British officer POW. They sent him to a prisoner of war camp in Poland. It would be the worst mistake they ever made. Jack Churchill spent exactly 1 month in that camp. He observed the guards, he studied their routines, he befriended other prisoners and organized them. And then on a moonless night in June 1944, he escaped through a drainage tunnel under the wire into the Polish countryside. The Germans launched a massive manhunt. They searched villages. They set up roadblocks. They brought in dogs. Jack Churchill walked 150 miles alone through occupied Poland. He stole food from farms. He hid in barns and forests. He avoided German patrols by traveling at night and sleeping during the day. He made it to the Baltic coast. He stole a small fishing boat, and he sailed across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, a neutral country. The Swedish authorities, shocked to find a British officer who had just escaped from a German POW camp and sailed across the Baltic alone, contacted British intelligence. Jack Churchill was flown back to England as a hero. The reception he received was not what he expected. British intelligence wanted to debrief him. They sat him in a room and asked him detailed questions about the German camp, the security procedures, the guard rotations. Jack answered every question with precision and clarity. But he was getting impatient. He had escaped from a German POW camp not to sit in an office answering questions, but to get back to the fight. The intelligence officers noticed something during the debriefing. Jack Churchill showed no signs of trauma, no nightmares, no hesitation. Most escaped prisoners needed weeks of psychological recovery. They were haunted by their captivity, by the violence they had witnessed, by the knowledge of how close they had come to death. Jack Churchill seemed annoyed that his war had been interrupted. One intelligence officer, a psychiatrist, was assigned to evaluate his mental state. The doctor asked him directly, "Colonel Churchill, do you feel any fear about returning to combat?" Jack looked at him like he had asked the stupidest question in the world. "Fear? I'm afraid of dying in a hospital bed at age 90, having wasted my life on safety. I'm not afraid of dying while doing something that matters." The psychiatrist wrote in his report, "Subject displays abnormal lack of self-preservation instinct. However, cognitive function is normal. Leadership capabilities remain intact. Recommend return to duty with observation." What the psychiatrist didn't understand was that Jack Churchill wasn't abnormal. He was simply operating on a different frequency than everyone else. Most people fear death. Jack feared mediocrity. Within days of his debriefing, Jack was cleared for duty. But the British command had a problem. They had a decorated war hero who had just escaped from a German POW camp. If they sent him back to Europe and he was captured again, it would be a propaganda disaster. The Germans would make sure everyone knew that the British officer who escaped had been recaptured. It would crush morale. So they made a decision. Jack Churchill was too valuable to risk in Europe, but there was another theater of war where his talents could be used. The Far East, Burma. The fight against Japan. Jack was thrilled. A new enemy, new terrain, new challenges, and the Japanese had never faced anyone like him. Before he could deploy, Jack was given a new command. A brigade of Gurkhas. These were the legendary Nepalese warriors who had served the British crown for over a century. They were famous for their kukri knives, their fearlessness in close combat, and their absolute loyalty to officers they respected. When Jack Churchill arrived to take command, the Gurkhas didn't know what to make of him. He showed up carrying his sword and his bagpipes. The Gurkhas, who had their own traditions of honor and martial prowess, recognized something immediately. This British officer wasn't just another colonial commander giving orders from the rear. This was a warrior. One of them. Jack spent weeks training with the Gurkhas. He learned their tactics. He studied their culture. He even learned basic Nepali so he could speak to them in their own language. And in return, he taught them something they had never seen before. He taught them to use the bagpipes as a weapon of psychological warfare. The Gurkhas were skeptical at first. What kind of weapon was music? But Jack explained his philosophy. When you go into battle, you want the enemy to see something they don't understand, something that makes them question their reality. Fear comes not from what you know, but from what you don't understand. The Gurkhas understood. They had their own traditions of war cries and intimidation tactics. The bagpipes, they realized, were just a more elaborate version of the same principle. Jack also noticed something about the Gurkhas that reminded him of himself. They fought not just with skill, but with joy. They loved the challenge of combat. They loved testing themselves against worthy opponents. They didn't see war as a grim necessity. They saw it as the ultimate test of a warrior's worth. Jack had found his people, but just as they were preparing for their first operation together, disaster struck. Not a military disaster, a political one. In the first weeks of March 1945, reports started coming in from Europe. The Germans were collapsing. The Rhine had been crossed. Allied armies were racing through Germany. The end was near. Jack watched the reports with growing dread. His war was ending. The enemy he had fought for 5 years, the enemy he understood, was about to surrender. He called his second in command, a Gurkha officer named Subedar Lal Bahadur Thapa. Bahadur Tapa. "The Germans are finished," Jack said. Lal Bahadur looked at him and saw something he had never seen before in the British colonel's eyes. Genuine sadness. "But sir," Lal Bahadur said, "this is good news. The war in Europe is won." Jack shook his head. "You don't understand. That war had honor. The Germans were worthy opponents. They fought hard. They respected courage. Now we're stuck fighting the Japanese in the jungle, and by the time we get properly started, they'll probably surrender too." Lal Bahadur later told this story to other Gurkhas, and it became part of their regimental legend. The story of the British colonel who was sad that his enemies were surrendering. It made perfect sense to the Gurkhas. A warrior without a worthy opponent is like a sword without an edge. Useless. Jack threw himself into planning the Burma operation with even more intensity. He knew time was running out. If he was going to have one last great fight, it had to be spectacular. He designed an operation that was vintage Churchill, a night assault on a fortified Japanese position. No artillery preparation, no air support, just Gurkhas with kukris and a British colonel with a sword and bagpipes hitting the enemy when they least expected it. But before they could launch the operation, it happened. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. Jack Churchill received the news while standing on a parade ground in India reviewing his troops. An aide rushed up with a telegram. "Sir, it's official. Germany has capitulated. The war in Europe is over." Jack read the telegram. He stood there in silence for a long moment. Then he crumpled the paper and threw it on the ground. The Gurkhas watching him saw something extraordinary. Their commander, the fearless Mad Jack Churchill, looked defeated. Not by the enemy, by peace. He turned to his men and addressed them in Nepali. "The Germans have surrendered. The cowards gave up before we could properly finish them. But we still have the Japanese, and I promise you, we will make this fight count." The Gurkhas cheered. They loved him, this British officer who spoke their language, who understood their warrior code, who was as disappointed by peace as they were. They would have followed him into hell. And in a sense, that's exactly where they were going. The jungles of Burma, where disease killed more men than bullets and the Japanese fought with suicidal fanaticism. But Jack Churchill never got his final battle. By August, before his brigade could launch their operation, the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over, and Jack Churchill's war, the war he had fought with such style and passion, ended not with a bang but with a whimper. He stood on that same parade ground in India on August 15th, 1945, when the announcement came. Veer Day. Victory over Japan. Celebrations erupted across the base. Soldiers cheered. Officers opened bottles of champagne. Everyone was ecstatic. Jack Churchill. He walked away from the celebration. One of his Gurkha officers found him an hour later, sitting alone on a hillside overlooking the camp. The officer sat down next to him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset. Finally, Jack spoke. "It's over. The greatest war in human history. The last time men could fight with honor and courage against worthy enemies. And I missed the ending." The Gurkha officer said, "But sir, you fought from the beginning. You were there at Dunkirk, at Sicily, in Yugoslavia. You fought in more battles than most men will ever see." Jack nodded. "I know. But it's not about the battles you fight. It's about the battles you miss. And now there won't be any more. Not like these. The next war will be fought with nuclear weapons and missiles. There won't be room for men like me, for men with swords." He was right, of course. The world had changed. The atomic bomb had made individual courage and skill irrelevant. Future wars would be decided by technology, by who had the biggest weapons, the most advanced systems. The age of the warrior, the age of the individual hero, was over. And Jack Churchill knew it. After the war, Jack Churchill did what Jack Churchill always did. He found new adventures. He became a passionate surfer, riding the waves off the coast of Australia. He worked as an instructor at a land-air warfare school, where he trained a new generation of soldiers. He became a parachutist. He sailed small boats across oceans. He continued to play the bagpipes at every opportunity. But the transition to peace was harder for Jack Churchill than any battle he had ever fought. In September 1945, he was back in England, attending debriefing sessions and awards ceremonies. The British government wanted to make him a symbol, a hero for the new peace. They arranged interviews with newspapers and magazines. They scheduled public appearances. Jack hated every minute of it. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. He wasn't interested in telling sanitized stories about the war to civilians who would never understand what it had really been like. In one particularly uncomfortable interview with the BBC, the reporter asked him, "Colonel Churchill, what was your most heroic moment in the war?" Jack's answer was not what they expected. "There are no heroic moments, only moments when you do what needs to be done. The rest is storytelling for people who weren't there." The interview was not broadcast. The BBC deemed it too cynical for public consumption. But Jack didn't care. He had already decided that peacetime Britain was not for him. The country was exhausted, bombed, rationed. Everyone was focused on rebuilding, on creating a new normal, on forgetting the war as quickly as possible. Jack Churchill couldn't forget, didn't want to forget. In 1946, he took a position as an instructor at the Land-Air Warfare School. It was as far from England as he could get while still remaining in the British Commonwealth. In Australia, he found something he had been missing: space. Adventure. A frontier mentality that reminded him of his younger days. He learned to surf, riding the massive waves off the coast with the same fearlessness he had shown charging German machine gun nests. Australian surfers in the late 1940s still tell stories about the crazy British colonel who surfed in all conditions, who paddled out in storms that kept everyone else on the beach. One lifeguard recalled he surfed like he was fighting the ocean, not trying to work with it, but trying to dominate it. And somehow, it worked. The man was either the bravest person I'd ever seen or completely insane. Probably both. Jack also discovered parachuting, not military parachuting, which he had done during the war, but sport parachuting. The thrill of freefall, the rush of adrenaline. It was the closest thing to combat he could find in peacetime. He became one of the pioneers of the sport in Australia, making hundreds of jumps and teaching others the basics of the discipline. But even these adventures couldn't completely fill the void. In private letters to old Commando friends, Jack admitted to a growing sense of purposelessness. "I was built for war," he wrote to one fellow officer in 1948. "And now there are no wars worth fighting. The world is dividing into two camps, East and West, nuclear powers with weapons so terrible that no sane man would use them. Which means the next war, if it comes, will either destroy us all or never be fought at all. Either way, there's no place for men like us." His friend wrote back with a suggestion. "Jack, you're looking for the wrong kind of fight. The war isn't over. It's just changed form. There are still places in the world where men fight with rifles and courage, where individual skill matters. Palestine, Malaya, Korea. Pick a conflict and go." It was tempting. Jack seriously considered joining conflicts as a mercenary or an advisor. But something held him back. He had fought for Britain, for his comrades, for a cause he believed in. Fighting for money or adventure alone felt hollow. He needed something more. He needed to believe in what he was fighting for. And in the messy, complicated conflicts of the post-war world, those clear lines of good and evil that had defined World War II were gone. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. Jack, now 44 years old, tried to volunteer. The British Army politely declined. "Too old," they said. Jack pointed out that he was in better physical condition than most 25-year-olds. Didn't matter. The Army had policies, age limits, and besides, Korea was a different kind of war. A limited war. A political war. Not the kind of total war where individual heroics mattered. Jack watched Korea from a distance, reading the reports, seeing the photographs. He saw young men fighting and dying in a war that their own governments weren't fully committed to winning. A war of attrition and stalemate, and he was grateful, in a strange way, that he hadn't been allowed to go. This wasn't his war. This wasn't the kind of fight where a sword and bagpipes would make any difference. Instead, he threw himself into civilian life with the same intensity he had brought to combat. He took up sailing, eventually participating in several ocean races. He became an expert motorcyclist, riding through the Australian outback on long solo journeys. He worked as a radio host for a time, interviewing other veterans and adventurers. And he continued to surf, to parachute, to seek out any experience that reminded him of the feeling of being fully, completely alive. In the late 1950s, Jack returned to England. Australia had been an escape, but it wasn't home. He settled in Surrey and took up more conventional hobbies. He became a passionate model maker, building intricate scale models of ships and aircraft. His house became a museum of his own life. Walls covered with photographs from the war, swords and kukris mounted on display, his bagpipes in a place of honor. Visitors to his home were often surprised by how normal he seemed. A pleasant, aging gentleman who tended his garden and talked about the weather, until someone asked him about the war. Then the fire would return to his eyes, He would pull down a sword from the wall and demonstrate the technique he had used to disarm German soldiers. He would bring out his bagpipes and play the same tunes he had played on the beaches of Normandy and in the mountains of Yugoslavia. Young soldiers hearing about the legendary Mad Jack Churchill would sometimes visit him for advice. They expected war stories, tales of glory and heroism. Instead, Jack would tell them the truth. War is not glorious, it's not heroic. It's terrible and brutal, and it destroys good men. But if you must fight, if there's no other choice, then fight in a way that you can live with afterward. Fight with honor, fight with courage, and never, ever fight from a distance if you can fight face to face. Because if you're going to take a man's life, owe him the courtesy of looking him in the eye. In the 1950s, he appeared on British television. The host asked him about his war service, about the sword and the longbow. Jack's response was vintage Churchill. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. And as for the longbow, it's a magnificent weapon, silent, deadly, and far more sporting than a gun. The host then asked the question everyone wanted to know. Were you ever afraid? Jack thought for a moment. Afraid? No. Concerned that I might not get to finish the fight properly? Yes. That worried me constantly. He lived a full and extraordinary life. He died in 1996 at the age of 89 in Surrey, England. His obituary in the Times of London read simply, Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, Commando, fought with sword and bow in World War II, deeply eccentric, completely fearless. At his funeral, a single bagpiper played a lament. It was the same tune Jack had played on beaches and battlefields across Europe and Asia. The mourners included former commandos, now old men, who remembered the crazy officer who had led them into impossible situations and brought them out alive. One of them, speaking at the service, said, Jack didn't fight the war the modern way. He fought it the right way, with courage, style, and absolutely no regard for what was sensible. The German officer he had captured in Sicily sent a letter that was read at the service. It said, in part, I met Colonel Churchill twice in my life. Once when he captured me with a sword, and once years later when we met at a reunion. Both times he terrified me. But the second time I understood. He wasn't trying to kill us. He was trying to remind us all what warriors used to be. I am honored to have surrendered to him. Jack Churchill's legacy is not in the 42 prisoners he captured, or the last man killed by a longbow in combat. His legacy is in the reminder that war, for all its horror and mechanization, is ultimately fought by individuals. And individuals can choose to face death with style, with courage, and with a complete refusal to accept that the old ways are dead. Modern special forces operators study Jack Churchill not because they're going to carry swords into battle, but because he understood something fundamental about combat psychology. Fear is contagious, but so is confidence. When a warrior walks into battle with absolute certainty of their superiority, the enemy feels it. They question themselves. They hesitate. And in combat, hesitation is death. The sword and the bagpipes weren't eccentricity. They were psychological weapons more powerful than any bullet. They sent a message. This man is so confident, so utterly certain of victory, that he brings medieval weapons to a modern war. And he wins. There's a photograph of Jack Churchill taken in 1944. He's standing on a beach in Italy. His uniform is dirty. His face is sunburned. In his right hand, he holds his sword. In his left, his bagpipes. And he's smiling, not a proud smile, not a victorious smile. The smile of a man who is exactly where he belongs, doing exactly what he was born to do. That photograph hangs in the Royal Marines Museum in Portsmouth, England. Next to it is the actual sword he carried through the war. The blade is scarred, nicked, stained. It's a working weapon that saw real use. And on the wall next to it is a simple plaque. It reads, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. 79 years after the end of World War II, we live in an age of drone strikes and cyber warfare. Combat is fought by men in air-conditioned rooms pressing buttons that kill enemies thousands of miles away. We've removed everything personal from war, everything human, everything individual. Jack Churchill would have hated it. He believed that if you were going to kill a man, you should look him in the eye. You should give him a chance. You should make it personal. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect. Because that's what warriors do. The modern military has no place for Jack Churchill. There's no room in the manual for men who fight with swords. No doctrine for officers who play bagpipes under fire. The age of the individual warrior, the knight-errant, the hero of legend, died somewhere in the mud of World War I. But for 5 years, in the chaos of World War II, Jack Churchill brought it back. He proved that one man, properly motivated and completely insane, could still change the course of battles. Not with superior firepower, not with technological advantage, but with sheer audacity and style. They mocked his medieval weapons. They called him Mad Jack. They said his methods were suicidal. But he captured 42 Germans with a sword, killed the last man in history with a longbow, and survived situations that killed thousands of others. He didn't survive because of his weapons. He survived because of his mind. He understood that war isn't just about killing, it's about will. And Jack Churchill's will was unbreakable. In 2021, a British Army major was asked in an interview if the modern military could use someone like Jack Churchill. The major smiled and said, "Absolutely not. We'd court-martial him in a week. But God, I wish we had him." Because men like that remind us why we fight. Not because of policy, not because of orders, but because there's something in the human spirit that refuses to bow, that sees impossible odds and charges anyway. That looks at the enemy and says, not with fear, but with absolute certainty, I will win. That spirit, that refusal to accept defeat, that absolute confidence in victory against any odds. That was Jack Churchill. That was Mad Jack. And that was the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield. If this story of the officer who fought World War II with medieval weapons inspired you, hit subscribe. We uncover the legends that changed history, the warriors that manuals forgot, the heroes who fought their way. Thanks for watching.